And it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon or this evening to tell you about some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing on autobiographical memory and experiences. So when we think about autobiographical memories, we actually have been introduced to autobiographical memory in the last discussion about dance movement therapy. These are memories of personally relevant past events from your own life. They're memories of things like the birth of a younger sibling or the first day of school. There are memories of things like winning a championship event, graduating from college, or being married. These are the events that make up who we are, our own personal identity. They put the auto, the individual, in autobiographical. And one of the bumper sticker descriptions of autobiographical memories is captured here from Alan Brown, a quote, "We are our memories." And what happens in dementia, of course, is that you lose your memories, and as a result of that, you lose your sense of personal identity. Autobiographical memories are pervasive. These are data from Averell Thorne that if you put individuals who are unknown to each other, you put them in a room and you say, just have a conversation for 10 minutes. Within 2 minutes, people begin sharing autobiographical memories. They begin telling perfect strangers about events from their personal past. Autobiographical memories are with us virtually for our lifetimes. We have autobiographical memories from childhood, adolescence, from middle age, and if we are fortunate, we will have our autobiographical memories well into our golden or elder years. There's also, though, a major discontinuity in autobiographical memory on the other side of the lifespan from dementia, and that is an autobiographical memory discontinuity that goes by the name of childhood amnesia. So when we think about the past, and if I were to ask you in the room to think about your earliest memory, the very first study that was ever published that asked that question found that the average age of earliest memory was age 3 years. And that study was published back in 1893. And for over a century since, in using a variety of methodologies and a variety of approaches, what we have found over and over again is that the average age of autobiographical memory among adults is between the ages of 3 and 4 years of life. And you get that estimate whether you give people a questionnaire, whether you ask them to just freely recall past events, or when you ask them about a targeted event, such as a sibling's birth. So if you have younger siblings, you know exactly when those siblings were born, so we can date that event. And what Scheingold and Tenney showed many years ago is that if you were between 1 and 3 years of age, you recalled almost nothing about the birth of your sibling. But if you were at least 3 years of age at the time the sibling was born, you have pretty good recall for that event. So this is another way of showing that for the first 3 years of life, we have very few if any, memories. There are also a lot of really interesting individual and group differences, and I'm just going to mention these briefly, and then if there's time for questions, I'd be happy to talk about them, but I'll just mention them briefly. The first is that although the average age of earliest memories between 3 and 4 years, some people have memories from about 1 year of age. 2 years of age is actually quite typical, quite common. And then there are some individuals who don't have early memories until they're 6, 7, or even 8 years of age. So if we were to poll this room, we would see that there's a lot of variability in the age of earliest memory. There also are birth order effects. If you are a firstborn child, you have earliest memories than if you are a second-born or a third or later born. It's also the case that there are some gender differences in age of earliest memory. So in study 1, here just a schematic, women tend to have earliest memories relative to men. Sometimes there's no difference between women and men, but what you do not find in the literature is men having earliest memories relative to women. So gender differences are relatively pervasive. And we also have culture group differences. So in the green bars are data from Western cultures, and by this we primarily mean the United States, Canada, Great Britain. And then in yellow are data from Eastern cultures, and primarily these data are from China and Korea. And what you see is that individuals from Western cultures have earliest memories relative to individuals from Eastern cultures. I actually don't know where Greece falls on these kinds of data. If anyone knows of a study of individuals from Greece, I'd be quite interested in knowing where they fall on this type of dimension. But regardless of this individual and group variability, for the first 3 to 4 years of our lives, we have relatively few to no memories, and then a gradually increasing number of autobiographical memories. So you can look at it schematically with the number of memories in the corpus on the y-axis and ages 1 to 10 years on the x-axis. And what you see is the first 3 to 4 years of life, there are hardly any memories. Those are the open bars. Then a gradually increasing number in the hashed bars, and then you start seeing a large number of memories. And interestingly, before age 8, the number of memories that we tend to have in our corpus, the number of autobiographical memories that we can recall, is smaller than what you'd expect based on just simply forgetting alone. That's indicated by the red bar. Okay, so there's a very nice empirical demonstration of this childhood amnesia, and it comes from data that were gathered by David Rubin at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and then that were fitted by Wetzler and Sweeney in a very famous paper. And this is a very simple technique. You say to a participant in the study, think of a memory associated with the word cat, chair, bottle, dog. You can use just any noun, right, or any event word, and say, think of the earliest memory and now date the event. How old were you when that event took place? And what you find, if you plot the age of those memories with very recent memories on the left side of the bar, and then distance in time as you go out to 18 years, what you see is that for most of the lifespan, the number of memories that people are able to retrieve and date is about what you would expect based on forgetting alone, as indicated by that red line. But there's one very notable exception, and that's those events from the first months and years of life. What you see is that there's a smaller number of those memories than you would expect based on forgetting alone. The number of memories falls off the distribution. Well, why do we have this amnesia? It's very well documented, it's very robust, there are individual differences to be sure, yet every study that we know of has found this kind of childhood amnesia. Well, it's typically explained in terms of late development of autobiographical memory. So if you think about autobiographical memory, it requires a lot to be able to think about past events. There are lots of elements that go into autobiographical memory. You have to have a self-concept. There has to be an auto in your autobiography. You have to be able to locate these events in time and place. Tell me when that event occurred. You have to have some understanding that what you're remembering is a past event. It's not an hallucination. It's not an ongoing event or experience. It is a representation of the past. It also depends, in addition to those very basic elements, it depends on a number of late developing cognitive achievements. One being a subjective perspective, an understanding that the perspective that I have on an event is different from the perspective that you have and you have and you have. We all have unique auto perspective. We also have to be able to mentally time travel, right? To recollect, have a vivid recollection of the past event. Oh, I remember my first trip to Greece, right? You have to be able to vividly recollect that. And you have to be able to weave those events into a life story or a narrative. Yes, when I was 10 years of age, my family moved, right? You know, it's all related, and that's what makes it an autobiography, right? So these elements are the elements that put the personal in the memory. And they are, thus, the autobiographical memory is thought to emerge only when these elements emerge in development. So the primary basis for this perspective on childhood amnesia, on why childhood amnesia occurs, it comes from examination of people's narratives, their verbal descriptions about past events. So when you look at the narratives that children provide, they tell you very matter-of-fact narratives, who did what to whom. And those narratives lack evidence of subjective perspective, of vivid recollection, and of this life story, these connections with other events. And that can be seen in a graph like this, where all that I'm showing here are adults in blue, they're on the top, and preschoolers, young children, in yellow on the bottom. And this is the percentage of narratives that mention who, what, where, when, why, and that personal subjective evaluation or perspective. And what you see is that for the who, what, and where, right, who did what to whom, children and adults don't differ as much, and they're certainly parallel with one another. But when you get to that location in time, that why the event occurred, and that all-important personal evaluation, the meaning the event has for you, what you see is that children provide much less evidence of that information in their narratives. The change in personal perspective, as I said, is apparent in the narratives, but it's especially apparent in how the elements are combined to actually tell a story. And the way we capture this in a lot of the autobiographical memory literature is a variable that's known as narrative coherence. It's the extent to which, if I tell you a story about my own personal past, it's the extent to which you can understand that story and you have a sense of where that event, when and where that event occurred, and the significance of the personal meaning of that event for me. And there are three dimensions of narrative coherence. That's the context, the chronology, and the theme. And theme is what I'm going to be paying particular attention to, because thematic coherence is the element of narrative coherence that really lends that personal perspective to autobiographical memory. And we score this on a 0 to 3 scale. If your narrative earns a 0, it's essentially off topic. I say to you, tell me about your vacation to Greece, and you start telling me about school lunch, right? Or some other random event. So it's not even on topic. A score of 1, you're at least on topic, but you don't really explain anything about why the event occurred. You don't evaluate it. You don't take any personal perspective on it. A score of 2 means that you're giving some interpretations and why it occurred the way it did and your understanding of the event. And then a score of 3 is the pinnacle, right? It's the extent to which you're really connecting this event in with other of your autobiographical memories and experiences, and maybe even talking about how it relates to you in the future. Oh, I had that experience and I really learned a lot from it, and I know going forward in my life I'm always going to eat my vegetables, right? It's not going to be that, but something that you're really taking that event forward into your life. This is a very, very busy slide. I apologize for that. I only want you to look at one thing, and that is look at the black bars. And what you see in data on the far left are data from children who were 3 years of age, and on the far right are data from individuals who average 52 years of age. And what I'm plotting here, or what we plotted in this paper, is the number of the score on that 0 to 3 scale. And what you see for the young children, if you look at the black bars, their scores are really quite low. And then you see this increase in this thematic coherence over the course of development. And so just focus on those black bars, and what you see is that increase in thematic coherence. That information, that picture, has been used to draw the conclusion, or is the basis on which rests the assumption that young children don't own their personal memories. That is, that they lack an autobiographical perspective. Adults convey meaning and significance in their narratives. They earn those scores of 3. Children, they convey the facts of who did what to whom, but you don't get the sense of that personal relevance or significance, that subjective perspective. And on that basis, it's been argued that rather than autobiographical, self-defining, personally relevant and significant, that children's memories are merely episodic. That is, they're memories of specific events, but they're not autobio, they're not personally relevant, they're not owned by the child. So at this point, the but wait, right, comes in, and to offer some cautions about that interpretation, because what I've provided you so far is evidence based on what children say, right? It's based on what our narratives say. Yet none of the studies, not even the one with the beautiful increase, none of the studies have directly compared children and adults in the same protocol. And moreover, if you think about what a narrative is something I provide to you, and then you, in your laboratory, you train some undergraduate students to code those narratives using that scale of 0 to 3. And what that always means is that someone else is determining the personal relevance or significance of that event. We're not asking the child directly, all right? Okay, so what we did in a recent study is to actually ask the children directly and to directly compare the narratives of children and adults. So what we did was to elicit autobiographical narratives from children and adults. We also asked them to rate their narratives, rate their memories on a number of dimensions. And the paper actually just came out with Nicole Hottenschwieler and Marina Larkina, just came out in the journal Memory. So the study design was as follows. We elicited from children 12 to 14 and adults who were college students. We elicited from them 3 memories that came from the period of their lives 1 to 5 years. 3 memories from 6 to 10 years. And then for the adults only, we asked for 11 to 15 years. Then we asked for the previous year, however old you are, 3 memories from the previous year, and then tell me about the most significant event in your life. And notice that for the black arrows, those memories are from the same period in life, 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, but obviously there's a different distance if you're recalling those events when you're a child versus an adult. In the red bar, that is a comparison that's from a different period in life, but it's the same distance in the past, right? And then the blue arrows, that's the same period and the same distance in the past. So what this design allowed us to do was to do a number of different comparisons of children's memories and adults' memories. And we obtained the memories through an online survey with 54 children and 56 adults. They did this in the comfort of their own homes. And we gave them, the first thing they received was a prompt that said, please provide as much detail as you can about your memory, in this case, a memory from 1 to 5 years. Please write more than 1 sentence. And then, what is your probable age at the time that event occurred, in years and in months? We then coded the narratives for length in words, and we coded it for this narrative coherence dimension, context, chronology, but importantly theme. We also then asked the participants to provide ratings of their events. So we asked them to rate the valence, was it positive or negative, arousal, how excited or bored were you, how important was the event at the time it occurred, how important is it to you now, and how unique is that event. We also asked them to rate their memories. So how vivid is your recollection? How confident are you of the details of your recollection, and how complete is your memory. So we have ratings of the events themselves and ratings of the memories. Now, we're going to look at these data in terms of some strong and some weak versions of that assumption that I told you about earlier. In terms of a strong assumption, this idea that only adults have this personal perspective on the events of their lives. If that's the case, then what you ought to see are differences between children and adults across the board. All of the memories ought to differ, and the ratings also ought to differ. You could also adopt a weaker perspective, or a weaker version of this assumption, and that is that this personal perspective gradually increases over the course of development, and therefore you would see it on the later memories, particularly for the adults, but not necessarily for the early memories. And then another alternative is that the personal perspective is going to be more apparent in the ratings than in the coding of the narratives, because what you're getting at in those ratings is the child's own perspective of the evaluation, or own evaluation of the event. Okay, so these are just some data to show that the memories that the children and the adults provided didn't differ where they shouldn't, and did differ where they should, in terms of the age from which they were drawn and so forth. But the real data I'd like to get to now are the data first from the narratives. And what I'm going to show are a number of graphs that have this same format. So what you're going to have on the y-axis is whatever the dependent measure is. In this case, it's the length of the narrative in terms of words. On the x-axis, memories from 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, 11 to 15, the previous year, and the most significant event. And remember that 11 to 15, that's comparing adults from 11 to 15 and children from 6 to 10. So for the child in the blue bar, the 6 to 10 year and the 11 to 15 year are always going to be the same, right? Because I'm reusing those data. Okay. And what you see in terms of the narrative length, it increases. Adults tell longer narratives than children. No surprise there. In terms of the narrative coherence, they didn't differ in the context or the chronology. These are the data from the thematic coherence. This is that measure of the extent to which you've knitted these memories into a life story or a personal perspective, and the way that you're taking perspective on your memories. And what you see is that adults and children differ from on that 11 to 15 comparison and the most significant event. But they don't differ on any of the other categories or any of the other time slices of autobiography. So in terms of a summary here, we have evidence of greater personal relevance or significance among adults for that 6 to 10 versus 11 to 15 comparison, and for the most significant event of your life. That pattern is not consistent with the stronger version of the assumption that only adults have this personal perspective. It's more consistent with a weaker version that this perspective develops over time, but it's unclear then why the previous year didn't have the adult-child difference. Okay, now let's look at the subjective ratings. We have ratings of the events themselves, ratings of the memories. First, for ratings of the events. Again, these are the same graphs. So these are the valence. This is how positive versus negative. Positive is a 9, negative is a 0. They only differ for 6 to 10 years. In other cases, the children and the adults are rating their events as equally positive or equally negative. In terms of arousal, we have data here that children are indicating that they were more aroused at the time of the event. But again, it's only for the 1 to 5 years and the 6 to 10 years. And it's children indicating higher arousal relative to adults. Uniqueness, here's the only place that we're going to see adults giving higher ratings than children. And you see that beginning in 6 to 10 years. So the adults are saying that the events that they're describing are more unique relative to the children. In terms of significance then, how significant, how important was this event at the time it happened? No differences. How important is this event to you now? No differences. Now in terms of ratings of the memories themselves, vividness. So there is a difference here between children and adults only for that 6 to 10 years. And notice again, it's the children are saying my memory is more vivid relative to the adults. Completeness, 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years. Again, it's the children saying my memory is complete, and the adults are giving slightly lower ratings. And then confidence in the details. The only place we see a difference here is at 6 to 10 years, and once again, it's the children saying they're more confident relative to the adults. So if we do a summary of these subjective ratings, we see that children rated the distant events, that is events from 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10, as more positive and arousing than adults. And we saw this in spite of the fact that the adults rated these events as more unique. So it's not that the children are giving more unique events relative to the adults. There are no differences in significance. So if you're going to talk about ownership, if you're going to talk about a personal perspective on your events, you'd expect to see it there in that significance rating. And we see no differences. Children rated their memories of distant events as more vivid, complete, and that they had greater confidence in the details. So what do we make then in terms of an overall summary of the subjective ratings? Well, they're not consistent with either the stronger or the weaker version of the assumption that only adults have personal perspective on their events. In fact, they're more consistent with a recency effects explanation. And that is that the more recent, the more contemporary the memory is, then higher ratings that you give to it. And because many of these events were closer in time for the children relative to the adults, the children are giving them higher ratings. But importantly, there are no differences in the significance, even though the adults are saying the events are more unique. Okay, so an overall summary then. We see that even in narratives, so the gold standard that we've used to say that children and adults differ with respect to the ownership that they take on their experiences, even when we look at narratives, we see few differences between children and adults. We see it only at 6 to 10 versus 11 to 15, and only on the most significant event. The pattern of subjective ratings is consistent with recency effects, not differences in personal significance or personal ownership. And the implication that we draw from these data is that the past is personal for children as well as for adults. So now just a quick return to this phenomenon of childhood amnesia with which I started my remarks. I said that it's typically explained in terms of differential ownership of memories of past events, that for children, they're not really autobiographical memories. They're not really autobiographical. They're merely episodic. And the primary evidence for that has been children's matter-of-fact narratives, who did what to whom, whereas adults provide this more individual, personalized narrative that indicates interpretation, cause, evaluation. So the evidence from the present research indicates that if we bypass the narrative, if we don't focus on the narrative and ask children directly by asking them to rate their events, their memories, we see that the pattern is more consistent with a recency explanation rather than differential personalization. So it suggests that we really need to look at basic memory processes, not narrative quality, but basic memory processes. And the explanation that I'm going to provide just very, very briefly here is in terms of accelerated forgetting. That actually what we see is that throughout childhood there's accelerated forgetting, and that accelerated forgetting is what produces childhood amnesia, not a difference in personal perspective. So I'm going to do this quickly. We see that evidence of early autobiographical memories comes from the present research. And we also see that there is a lot of evidence, other evidence, that children are forming autobiographical memories. This comes primarily from a study of Harlene Hayne, that in fact if you ask young children, 5-year-olds, 8 to 9-year-olds, 12 to 13-year-olds, and then 18 to 20-year-olds, what you see is that for 18 to 20-year-olds, the average age of earliest memory is 3 to 3.5 years, between 3 and 4 years, just like I showed you at the very beginning. Whereas for children, the average age of earliest memory is actually earlier in life. Yet by the end of the first decade of life, children also experience childhood amnesia. So these are the data that I showed very early about the number of different studies of adults, the average age of earliest memories between 3.5 years. These are now data from children, and they aren't meant to line up point to point, but these are data from children showing the average age of earliest memory for children tested at various points in their development. And what you see is that by the time they approach 10 years of age, their average age of earliest memory looks just like it does for adults. So why is it that when we ask younger children, they have earliest memories, but by the age of 10 years, it's just like adults? And the explanation that we've been providing in my laboratory is that it's because of an accelerated rate of forgetting in childhood, and a rate of forgetting that actually slows over the course of development. And I'll just go to the direct empirical demonstration here in the interest of time, that what I'm showing here are data that are reflecting of a deceleration in the rate of forgetting. This is actually a parameter that's known as the B parameter, and it indicates, it's a direct indication of the rate of forgetting. And the higher the B parameter, the faster forgetting; the lower the B parameter, the slower the rate of forgetting. And what you see is that for 7-year-olds, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds, college students, and adults, that over the course of that period of time, the rate of forgetting actually slows. So if we keep this in mind, it actually gives us a new perspective on the development of autobiographical memory. It actually produces a very different picture of the distribution of autobiographical memories that I showed you earlier. And I'm going to do a shameless plug here in terms of a paper that actually has now just come out in Psychological Review. It's no longer in press. It's actually available on a complementary processes account of autobiographical memory development. And the complementary processes account, the major premise is that autobiographical memory is not especially late to develop. Personal memories are formed in childhood. We saw that from the data today. And that we experience childhood amnesia because of the complementary process of forgetting. That personal memories are formed but then lost to forgetting. And memories that are formed early in life are especially vulnerable to forgetting. And what this does is, rather than a gradual increase, such as I showed earlier on in that slide, if you actually flip that figure around and change the axes, what I think that figure actually is reflecting is the relatively sparse residual that results from forgetting. So rather than a gradually increasing number of memories over the lifespan, what you have is actually memories are formed, but then they're forgotten, and because forgetting is accelerated early in life, you have fewer memories that survive. So overall summary and conclusion here: autobiographical memories of our personal past, those of which we take ownership and have significance for us as individuals. They're with us virtually for our lifetimes, with the salient exception of childhood amnesia. Historically, that amnesia was attributed to late development of autobiographical memory. But the alternative complementary processes account that I've briefly outlined here tonight, it acknowledges early development of autobiographical memory, that there is an initially faster or accelerated rate of forgetting, and that's why we have few memories that survive beyond childhood. The residual after forgetting results in the typical distribution of personal memories, though here I've flipped it on its axis. And with that, I want to just thank you, the audience, after a long day of conferencing, for your attention tonight. My funding sources: the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. I also received funding from the Emory College of Arts and Sciences. And I thank the children and parents and adults who gave of their time to participate in the research that I've described for you tonight. And of course, the members of my Memory at Emory laboratory group here depicted. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Mrs. Bauer, for your very, very interesting presentation and topic. There is any question from the audience?
Possible link between the early non-verbal stage and narrative? So it's like early memories are connected to a part of life where actually language does not exist. So maybe I'm just, thinking this up right now. I have no evidence or anything. I'm just.
No, the question is whether that early memories may be represented non-verbally, and that you don't capture that in a narrative by definition. If the memory is nonverbal, then you're not going to be able to capture it in a narrative. And that's a very, very interesting and very provocative way of thinking about childhood amnesia. The problem that we come into is that this autobiographical memory is defined verbally. And we have Endel Tolving to thank for that. Endel Tolving, the individual who created this episodic, semantic, and autobiographical memory distinction, has defined autobiographical memory verbally, and therefore you exclude from consideration anything that's that is nonverbal. I will add that there is very little evidence of early nonverbal memories becoming verbally accessible. And several laboratories have produced really nice, well-controlled tests of that question, and there really is very little evidence of it. It's not that it's non-existent, but it's very sparse. But thanks for the question.
I was just curious if you had a rationale for why forgetting is so accelerated early in life?
Thank you. The question is, do I have a rationale for why forgetting is accelerated early in life? And yes, the primary reason that we believe that forgetting is accelerated early in life has to do a lot with the neural substrate that is responsible, that is absolutely necessary for episodic memories in general, autobiographical memories in particular, and that neural substrate involves medial temporal lobes, it involves the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and obviously the network of connections between those neural structures. Although a lot of brain development, of course, occurs in the first 3 years of life, first 5 years of life, every study shows that brain development is taking longer and longer into adolescence and early adulthood. And one of the primary reasons we think that that forgetting is accelerated throughout the first decade of life has to do with essentially the maturity of that substrate. I think he'd like you to wait for just a second.
You said that you don't have any evidence from Greece.
Do you have some?
Here we have many presentations from the departure of early childhood education, Day of Athens, and we are very interested in a cooperation, or we would like to ask you if we could use your mail to have a communication to give you some evidence, if you are interested in.
I would be very interested, and I put my email up at first. Is there a way to get that first slide? Thank you.
Yes, so we can.
That would be fantastic. The approaches that we use lend themselves. Oh, I didn't. Oh, okay. Well, Patricia .Bauer at Emory, EMORY, .edu. That's it.
Okay.
It's a simple one. Patricia .Bauer, and I'd be happy to write it down for you. But I would be delighted, and the paradigms that we have could readily lend themselves to translation into Greek, and then use. And I would
Did
really
you say Emory?
EMORY, Emory.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope to hear from you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much.